Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Welsh Planning Live. I'm Simon Power. I work for MacDonald and I'm chair of RTPI this year. And what a strange year it's been. Welcome to this first session organised by RTPI Cymru. I'd just like to thank our sponsors, Savills and Francis Taylor Building, whose logos you can see on the screen in this excellent setup we've got here. So this is really to set the scene for the week, which is to outline some of the challenges that we have from the point of view of climate change, net zero, and how the need to mitigate our carbon emissions is filtering through into the work and actions of planners in Wales in 2020. If you're tweeting about this week, it's hashtag Wales Plan Live 2020, all one word. And during this session, obviously, you're invited to put any questions on the message board, and we'll come back to them after the speakers are presented. So we have two speakers today. The first is academic, is Rick Lupton from the University of Bath. But I think in terms of Rick, and the work, he's actually part of a research program called UK Fires, which was a report that I personally came across and read and was very impressed in terms of it, perhaps for the first time, being frank about what achieving net zero 2030 really meant for society. And I thought it would be great to have someone from UK Fires to open this week and really give us an idea of the scale of this challenge. And then Rick is followed by Rita Singh from Kingspan, but Rita also previously used to work with Welsh Government on the directors. She was director of the Charity Society of Wales. So between the two, we should get a good understanding of the challenge, and then obviously we can open it up for questions. We've only got an hour today. So without further ado, Rick, I'll hand over to you, if that's okay. I can see your slides on the screen. I will disappear.
Yep, thank you, Simon. Thank you for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here at the start of the conference. So as you said, the work I'm going to present today is what we're doing in UK Fires. And what we'll talk about is firstly about absolute zero, why we're framing the UK's climate change goals in that way, and then talk a little bit about what that means for us. So you probably know that in 2019 Theresa May updated the UK's Climate Change Act from a target of an 80% reduction to a target of at least 100% or net zero. And this is a very ambitious target, which is exactly what is needed, and it makes the UK one of the first in the G7 to have a formal net zero target alongside only 4 or 5 other countries. It's the right target to have, but because it was introduced in secondary legislation without very much debate about the implications of the target, I think if there had been more debate, no one was really fully clear probably on what the implications of this were, and we might not have had this target if there had been more debate about it at the time. So the target talks about net zero, whereas today the title of the session is absolute zero, and the difference of course is whether you include negative emissions, so that's carbon emissions that are absorbed by forests or other land, or removed from the atmosphere through technical means. And the idea of net zero is that it allows for some emissions to continue in some places as long as they're removed again elsewhere. But the problem with that is that we don't really have any meaningfully scaled negative emissions technologies currently available. This diagram shows the sources of UK emissions, so this is UK territorial greenhouse gas emissions in 2018, from generating energy, from business, industry, transport, residential and so on. And the majority of those are currently emitted to the atmosphere. There's some part that's currently stored in forests and in other land, but the majority are emitted to the atmosphere. if we're talking about negative emissions, the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering had a report recently that looked at all of the options for greenhouse gas removal. They found 3 methods that were ready for deployment, which could save around 35 megatons per year. So that's a similar size to what's currently being stored, could be doubled. So that would help, but it's still small compared to what's currently being emitted, and it will only help for a limited time, because as we increase the amount of forests that we've got, that has a benefit, but it reduces over time as those forests take up the land. You might also hear a lot about carbon capture and storage. That features heavily in many of the plans for reaching this zero emissions goal. Just for a sense of scale, the grey bar on here is a very generous, showing how much carbon capture and storage is going on in the whole world, whereas all of the other emissions on the left that are being emitted are just for the UK. So practically none of that CCS that's occurring is in the UK. I think it's 0.00036 megatons a year associated with Drax is actually operational, which is thousands of times smaller than the building materials and the other bars you can see there. So we don't really have any options for negative emissions currently available. What about new technologies? You might say, well, it's okay that we don't have these technologies available now. We've still got some time to get there, and that I'm sure that will be true eventually. But I think the problem that we've got to face is the time it takes for these things to be developed. This picture is a simplified summary from a recent review of past technological and societal transitions that's currently under review for publication. And across the middle we have the time, starting on the left-hand end from when the invention was first came up with, coming across through this delay period when it's being developed but not widely used, until it first reaches significant commercialization in the middle, and then starts to grow and spread out, and the top and bottom of the graph correspond to 100% saturation of that technology. And you can see in these past transitions it just does take a long time. It was over nearly 100 years from the first wind turbine being invented as a technology until it started to be widely commercialized in Denmark, and that process of growth is still ongoing. Nuclear power was invented and first made to work 40 years before it started to be widely commercialized in France. So even though these technologies are currently being worked on, then there's a limit to how fast they can be rolled out. Another example of that could be the Queensferry crossing, the replacement for the Forth Road Bridge north of Edinburgh. So that took about 13 years from realising that there was a problem, that it would need to be replaced. If it wasn't replaced, then part of Scotland just north of Edinburgh would be effectively cut off from the area to the south, but it still took 13 years to go through that whole process and replace that critical piece of infrastructure. And I think the point is, it's not about the Manhattan Project. It's not about demonstrating the first wind turbine or the first power station that has carbon capture and storage and can operate with zero emissions. It's then the process of rolling that out to every power station in the country and across the world, which simply takes time to happen. So given that we have a legal target for net zero emissions in 2015, the negative side of net zero is small during that time, so we can't rely on continuing to emit and taking those emissions out of the atmosphere, and there's not enough time to rely on any new technologies or magic bullets solving the problem at large scale during the next 29 years. What does that mean for what could happen in the next 29 years? So that's the topic of our report, and you can find more details there, but I'll give some overview of that now. These are the UK's emissions on the left. Most of it comes from producing energy. Some comes from land use, producing meat, waste processing and other industrial processes. And clearly all of those emissions have to stop by 2050. That means either switching to a non-emitting equivalent, or if there's no alternative available, which is the case for some of these things that we'll come on to in a minute. It means simply stopping doing that activity. Currently we use the energy in many forms, shown in the middle bar. So all the parts at the top, burning gas, burning oil, those will have to change, and the heat pumps, the boilers that are currently burning the gas in people's houses will have to become heat pumps or other electrical heating. The cars that burn the oil for transport will have to become electric vehicles. Then of the part of the energy that we use at the bottom, which is electricity, which is shown on the right hand bar, about half of that is currently non-emitting and half of it is coal and gas. So those will have to stop, and the non-emitting sources will need to be grown as fast as we can. If we look at how that's been going, these are the non-emitting generation, gas, coal and oil, that will have to go down to zero. Non-emitting generation has been growing roughly linearly from 2010, the last 10 years or so. Given what we said before about the rates of development of large infrastructure projects, I don't think we should bank on vastly greater growth rates than we see now. Obviously there's a lot of uncertainty about what the actual rate will turn out to be. But if we take that current rates and extrapolate them forwards to 2050, we'll see a vast increase in non-emitting electricity supply, much greater than we have now. But if we compare it to all the ways that we currently use energy in buildings, transport, industry, then we can anticipate that there will still be a gap between the amount of non-emitting electricity that we have available and the amount of energy that we project needing. And in addition, there are still these other activities that produce emissions directly that we'll come back to in a minute. So just to give a flavour of what's in the report, we look at each of these sectors and how that energy gap could be bridged. In buildings, for example, if we simply electrified the way that we operate buildings currently, then we would need the 520 terawatt hours or so to run buildings on the left. But given the constraints to how much non-emitting energy we think we might have, we'll need to reduce that, and through various measures such as heat pumps, which are more efficient, appliance efficiency, turning down thermostats, smaller appliances, making all new builds passive, retrofitting existing buildings with insulation and glazing, making lighting more efficiently. You could stack those up in different ways to make the 60% reduction required. And I'm not trying to say that that's easy, but those are all technologies that exist and are used. So in some cases turning down thermostats, we could do that tomorrow. Other ones take more effort, but they are things that we know we could do. However, there are still some activities that we don't have options for electrifying and making non-emitting. So, international air travel, currently that relies on burning kerosene, and there aren't any technical alternatives available to that at the moment. There could at some point be electric planes, but they're not going to be ready for commercial long-haul operations for a long time, and still you have the problem of where the electricity to charge them comes from, which, as we've just seen, is likely to be in short supply. Similarly with shipping, we don't have any alternatives for powering international long-distance shipping, so on the face of it, until we've come up with an alternative for that, we'll have to reduce the amount that we import and export. Cement has process emissions associated with it, so even apart from the need for high temperature heat that comes from fossil fuels, just from the process of making cement there are emissions. We don't currently have any way of making large quantities of cement without those emissions, so we'll have to stop producing new cement until we find another way. And of course there is beef and lamb farming, which produces methane emissions, which currently we don't have any alternative to. So where does that leave us for what we can do about it? And it's really interesting to compare the situation with climate change to the situation with the coronavirus pandemic. In preparing for the pandemic, then there was a lot of emphasis placed on technical solutions, so being able to develop a vaccine quickly that would allow us to control the pandemic. And that would have been very successful if it had worked, but as we've seen, we haven't got there yet. There's quite a lot of uncertainty about how quickly that can provide a solution. and in the end, to be able to contain the pandemic, then we had to swing from relying on technology across to requiring large levels of societal participation and changes to the way that we live in the lockdown. Similarly, with climate change, if you look at most of the scenarios for the future development of energy, they rely quite heavily on carbon capture and storage being widespread and implemented by the time that we need to reduce emissions. And obviously, if that could be done, that would be great. That would let us carry on with minimal changes to the way that we live. But it's quite a risky bet for all the reasons that I've been talking about. And if we go down that route and we find that that hasn't delivered the emission savings we need in time, we would be forced to switch into a lockdown type response where we simply use less energy because there is less non-emitting energy available. In both cases, there's perhaps a middle ground where we could be preparing more, doing the things that we know how to do that would get us ready to reduce those emissions or contain the virus, whether that's having stockpiles of PPE or an extensive workforce doing contact tracing. So we're not saying those are easy, but they are things that we could do today if we decided to. Similarly with climate change, if we focused more on making sure cars were smaller and had more people in them, we heated our buildings less, we built fewer things, used the buildings more, flew less, switched to heat pumps, those are all things that we can start to do now, which would reduce the risk of needing to make sudden and dramatic changes later on to contain emissions. Another way of looking at that is that in the case of coronavirus, our goal is to reduce transmission to zero because we don't have the technology yet in the form of a vaccine to allow us to do that while maintaining our social interactions. We've had to accept some restraint in the short term, but once that technology does come along, we'll be able to go back to normal or even better. Similarly, in the bottom right, our goal is to get emissions to zero. In the short term, we don't have the technology to do that without having some constraints and changes to the way that we use energy. But once we do develop CCS and we have time to install more non-emitting energy sources, then the amount of energy we have available will increase and it will be a relatively short-term problem. So finally, within the UK Fires Programme, we're perhaps more focused on our living lab of industrial partners and how they can exploit the opportunities that this viewpoint presents to find innovation opportunities that are compatible with an absolute zero future. It would be interesting to see how relevant that is to the planning context. I'm not sure of the answer to that, so that might be an interesting discussion. One of the things we're doing there is to use a framework called the Value Lab, developed by Professor Phelan at the Business School in Oxford, which is really based around the idea that the greatest breakthroughs in value creation come when you have a unique theory of value, when you've got a contrarian belief that most people don't agree with, and then you can see a unique way of creating something. So just as an example, you probably agree that the viewpoint that I've just put forwards, that we won't be able to have any new cement, is quite unorthodox. The orthodox view is probably not that we will completely stop producing cement, but if you do take that belief that we'll be able to have enough built space to live well even though we're not producing new cement, there's an obvious problem with that. For example, without cement we don't currently know how to create foundations for new buildings, so we won't be able to build any new buildings. But that also presents opportunities. Should we be looking at extending existing buildings vertically, where there's excess capacity in the foundations they were built with and designed for? Could we add some extra floors to increase that capacity? Can we reconfigure the space that we've already got, develop new ways of being flexible between home and office, and so on? We've started to explore this in a series of innovation workshops. We had one on the energy system back in July. There's one focused on the construction sector coming up in October or November, with other sectors to follow, so please do get in touch if you're interested in those. So thank you for your attention. That's the end of my presentation, and I look forward to hearing any questions later when we get to that. Thank you.
Talking. Thank you, Rick. Lots to think about, and that was definitely the more modest, less challenging, and less detailed version. For those that look at the report, it is quite startling what absolute zero really means, and I think there's a big gap between rhetoric and reality, which you very gently just touched on in one or two cases. So without further ado, I can hand over now to Rita, who I just touched on, but Rita is there you are, Head of UK Public Affairs for Kingspan, who, amongst other things, make insulated panels and insulation for buildings and construction, which is where I've heard of them. But as I say, Rita has worked as an engineer for over the last 20 years, working in a whole range of different public and private third sectors in Wales. And I'm interested to hear what your take on it is, Rita, if I hand over.
Thank you so much, Simon.
Rita, sorry to interrupt.
Hi.
Could you just turn your microphone up very slightly, please?
Yes, of course. Is that any better? Hi, can you hear me okay?
A little bit more, please.
Okay, hang on, let me go.
There we go, that's perfect.
Is
Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Okay, next slide, please. So thanks so much, Diolch to everyone, and for inviting me to speak today. And as I think just before we went live, we were saying that this week is Climate Action Week, with New York Climate Action Week taking place and World Green Building Council's Green Building Week. So it's perfect time for me to come on and talk to you about planning and building and what we can do to take climate action in these areas. So just a little bit of background about my organization. So Kingspan, as many of you may know, started about 60 or so years ago. Irish-based, but we are globally. We have about 130 sites in about 70-odd countries with over 10,000 people employed. Next slide, please. But as an organization, we are market leaders. We are in 5 divisions. Insulation boards and insulation panels are the biggest part of what we do, with a revenue of about 4 billion euros, I believe. And in Wales, we sort of top and tail Wales with sites in both Holywell and in Cardiff through our different divisions. But over the last few years, we've kind of been looking at, so who are we all as an organization, and what sort of commitments and long-term targets do we want to set for ourselves. So over the last 9 or so years, we've been working on being a net zero energy company. And by the end of this year, we should be net zero across all of our manufacturing sites in all of globally, which is a massive achievement for a manufacturing company, majority of which of ours, goes into energy use. But we were looking at, so where do we go from there? So we've set ourselves quite ambitious 10-year targets where we want to get to net zero carbon across all of our manufacturing processes. We want to get to net zero waste to landfill. We want water issues, circularity, recycling within our products. We want to try and get to as many of these, planet passionate targets, as we're calling it. We've also been exploring how we can bring more recycled content into our production, into our products. We're also looking at chemical recycling. So for example, one of our targets is to recycle about 1 billion PET bottles by 2025 into our products. So it'll be used as a raw material in our products. And some of our more stringent targets are things like reducing by 50% the product CO2 intensity from our primary supply partners. So we're working not just as an organization internally, but we're also working with our supply chain partners. And so we've committed to things like the SBTI, scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So we're looking at everything in a more holistic sense. So that's the sort of thing that I'm coming at it in terms of my organization. But as Simon mentioned, I've also been beside Wales and involved in policy making by supporting Welsh government. And so some of the perspectives I bring today is as a trustee of one of the most iconic places in Wales, the Wales Millennium Centre, which for the first time in its entire history has seen its doors shut. So for a cultural organization, as an institute almost, a very iconic place. Where everyone identifies Wales with the image of the Wales Millennium Centre, to have its doors shut at a time when everyone needs that community voice. It feels very strange. I'm also a trustee of the Fair Trade Wales, where sustainable livelihoods is key to everything. And having worked inside of Wales, where lives are depending on how we live sustainably and use resources more efficiently. So all of those perspectives have kind of given some interesting insights into, so how do we pick ourselves up from where we are now to move forwards? And so some of the little light of hope that I tend to get is obviously, the very interesting legislation that we have in Wales, which is the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is kind of like a whole new operating system for how Wales operates as a public body. So everything devolved needs to show how you contribute to those 7 goals. And those goals have never been more important than they are at the moment. Next slide, please. And one of the things I was looking at in terms of, what is the best way of looking at how we pick ourselves up from where we are now. And there was a fantastic quote from Julie James in the Building Better Places report that came out over the summer. And some of the things that she said in there is that even in this time of economic hardship for many in the development industry, we cannot fall back on quick build, poor quality development on sites which are not sustainable. This is a once in a generation opportunity for us to actually show what we're capable of developing and how we can really give a little bit more hope, encouragement, use all the innovative capacity that we have to try and do things better. And in that sense, I think the other thing that she's also mentioned is about how good places are the result of good planning. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here by saying something like this. But the other thing that also has a lot of resonance is she mentions about that this whole publication is about providing an action plan of how communities of tomorrow benefit from foresight of today. And I think that is critical. And the foresight of today that we have is looking at, so where do we find ourselves? Next slide, please. And it is on, can we go? Yes. So it is on things like the global challenge of where we, I'm sure you've seen these sort of images everywhere about what happens if we don't get to maintain 1.5 degrees, if we get to 2 and 3 and 4. And I think there was a recent report from WWF on the impact of biodiversity, where we've, so many of our species have now become extinct, so many on the verge of being extinct. And much of this is in our hands. And I think there was an excellent quote where someone said, we are the generation that has all the resources available to us, all the innovative capacity to do something about the difference that needs to be made in trying to address some of these huge challenges. I mean, just in terms of figures where we find ourselves, global greenhouse gas emissions have increased 41% since 1990. And even at one point when we thought that we were stabilizing our emissions about 3-4 years ago, I think last year or the year before, they increased by a degree again, by a percent. And some of the biggest areas that we need to start to look at are things like energy consumption, of which, this includes transport, electric and heat generation, manufacturing industries, as well as then agriculture, land use, industrial processes, etc. All of these which are the biggest sources of greenhouse gases. And of course, we've all been experiencing over this last decade, which has seen some of the hottest temperatures that our planet has experienced. And the unpredictable nature of our weather patterns as well, where we're seeing hotter, drier, wetter, all kinds of weather patterns that, where things were a little bit more predictable, has become less so. And we're likely to see an increase in all of this. So the plan of action seems to be, or the agreed consensus is that we need to slash our greenhouse gases by 50% by 2030. So in 10 years' time, we need to reduce everything by at least 50%, and then to get to net zero carbon by 2050. Next, please. So what does that mean for UK? So, I mean, as Rick mentioned, we are one of the first countries in the world to set ourselves a net zero carbon target by 2050. And if we look at where we have been since 1990, we've seen something like a 43% decrease in our emissions since 1990. And if we carry on with this, hopefully the only emissions we may be seeing if we get to net zero will be in international aviation, shipping, and non-IAS sectors. But if you look at the 2017 bar, we're seeing that although the power and the industry sector have gone down, the buildings and transport have barely moved in terms of reducing emissions. And there are all indications that apparently our 4th and 5th carbon budget, which take us to 2030 and beyond, I think by mid-2030s, we are likely to miss those carbon budgets. So there's a lot of work to be done. Next, please. And success is very mixed. So whereas power and industry have reduced a lot, you will see the buildings, for example, have only gone down from something like 100 megatons to about 80 megatons of CO2 emissions. And I was looking through the UKCCC's climate report, progress report that came out in the summer, I think it was in June, only a couple of months ago, where they kind of gave a marking on government's progress to date. And they said while the net zero carbon target and putting it into legislation gave a strong signal globally of what UK is looking to do and drive the changes, they basically gave us, I would call it a C- in terms of the progress being made or lack of progress, because there's a lot of policy being lagging in policy, particularly on building and heating policies, and we are off track on many of the targets that government has set itself. So there's a lot of work to do as we speak. And next, please. If we then look at the regional breakdown and we look at where Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is, so Scotland seems to have made the biggest reduction in emissions. Wales, hardly any. Northern Ireland, again, pretty much very similar to Wales, but it's a much lower emissions rates. But then there's a lot of issues coming from Wales because we are net exporters of energy. We have some of the oldest housing stocks. All of those need to be considered when we're looking at the steps that Wales needs to take in order to reduce its emissions and at least see the sort of decline that Scotland is seeing at the moment. And this is a breakdown of some of the sectors where we're seeing emissions, and particularly for Wales, which is in red. In the bar chart, you see that in all other sectors, Wales is the highest. In industry, it is the highest. And in agriculture and others, you know, it's kind of, it's Northern Ireland is much higher, Scotland, and then Wales. Next, please. If we look more deeper into where our different sectors in Wales and the greenhouse gas emissions, we can see the reductions taking place within industry and power sector. And obviously the closure of Aberthaw has given us the biggest reduction in emissions as a result. But buildings, shipping, surface transport are areas that still need a heck of a lot of improvement. And all of these have planning implications. So as we come forward and as the National Infrastructure Commission is starting to look at these areas, including digital connectivity, energy, transport issues, we need to start to look at, well, we're already looking at, you know, what does this mean from a planning perspective if we want to try and get to, or when we want to try and get to net zero carbon by 2050, or at least as the UK Climate Change Committee suggested, 95% for Wales, or the government has said, Welsh government has said they want to try and get to net zero by 2050. Next slide, please. So I wanted to have a quick look at some of the policy challenges that we face as a result of where we are. So yes, recognizing that we have some of the oldest stock in Wales. When you just start to look at, you know, some of the policy impact and look at what difference it's been making or has made in the past. So I just wanted to look at, from my own industry, the progress in things like insulation in Wales. So where we're talking about, you know, a lot of the emissions are coming from buildings, residential and commercial, and something like 70% of of energy consumed in homes goes towards heating and electricity. You start to look at some of the measures that have been put in place and where we are now. So if you look at, say, on the right-hand side, the loft insulation, well, we were at our peak in 2012, sorry, for the most amount of loft insulation put in. And since then, we've seen a massive decline. And this is a quote from the Climate Change Commission, where the current rate of installation of loft and wall insulation at just 5% of its peak in 2012. And this is one of the easiest ways in which we can start to look at energy consumption, because if energy consumption does make up about 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions, then we need to start to look at, well, what are the measures that we can start to take in terms of reducing those emissions. And this seems one of the most easiest ways of trying to do so, which is trying to make sure the fabric of our building at least isn't leaky and is able to retain as much of the heat that we are utilizing. And as Rick was mentioning, that if we do convert to electricity fully, it will need so many 100 terawatt hours of electricity, whereas if we start to look at passive house new build and retrofitting that can reduce that substantially. And these are some of the low-cost measures that we can start to take. And there was an excellent report, again in the summer, from the Grantham Institute, which was looking at multiplier effects of things that we can do short-term and long-term to as part of this whole green recovery plan. And insulation, new build, retrofit measures seem to be some of the quick win solutions that we can put in place. But the progress, given what we're seeing in front of us, seems to be very mixed. And whereas, at its peak, we had about 1 million or so installations taking place, at the moment, it's very low. And I'm not sure, given the Green Homes grant that has been introduced for England, it's a 6-month project which kickstarts at the end of September, needs to be completed by end of March next year, for £2 billion worth of installations, and they're hoping to do, I think, 600,000 homes. And there is some doubt on whether all of that money can be invested and how quickly companies are able to move to have these installations installed in people's homes. 6 months just does not seem long enough to be able to do so. So we need to have more clear, long-term, consistent policies in order to put some of these measures in place. And it's not that technology, waiting for fantastic brand new technologies to do this. All of this exists at the moment. Next, please. There's also an interesting one about, do we pay now or do we pay later, where the UKTCC looked at, the cost of retrofitting. So we have future home standards that are going to be introduced in UK very soon, and Wales is also putting its updates on Part L for energy efficiency. And if we don't start making zero carbon homes now, we will then end up paying a lot more for retrofitting those homes to be zero carbon homes. So why don't we start to do that right from the beginning? Why do we need to put a Part L that's an interim measure? Why can't we start to have zero carbon homes now? And those of you who may be around in the industry, may be familiar with things like the Code for Sustainable Homes, which is about trying to get to Code 6, which was zero carbon. And I think it was introduced in 2012, and by 2016, when we were supposed to get to zero carbon homes, in 2015, that whole policy was disbanded by the government of the day, which was a huge shame because companies were gearing up to trying to get to zero carbon homes. And if you give certainty in a policy, then companies will adapt. They will try and make sure that the products, the process, the installation, the maintenance, all of those match. But if the policy keeps changing, then there is no certainty about how industry needs to adapt. So clear, concise policy is central to this. Next, please. So we do have something like a roadmap. And again, I've just taken this from the report, progress report from the Climate Change Committee. And we know the sectors that need to improve, and we know the time frame of those improvements, and we know what we need to offset for all of those that are difficult to reduce emissions to net zero on. And this is the transition that is needed. And I guess in amongst all of these, potentially apart from the international aviation shipping, all of these areas have planning implications. And I suppose this is where industry like ours, construction industry, need to work hand in hand with the energy companies, the planning companies, because what I'm seeing is there's very similar common messages emerging in terms of what we want to try and achieve. And it'd be great to look at how we can work together as, trying to address the impact of these sectors. And next, please. And there are some fantastic offshoots, green offshoots that we're starting to see. The decarbonising of our energy has already started to come down. And we're seeing that if you look at the cream bar, which shows your fossil fuel range, the range for PV and onshore wind is already predicted to go much lower than the fossil fuel costs. So we know that these are good news stories that are starting to come through. And so these are things that we need to start to leverage and see how we can plan them into our buildings and into our spaces, public spaces. Next, please. And interestingly, the other one that I've seen the Secretary of State for Bays referring to quite regularly, especially as he's also the chair for COP26 taking place next year, is about how UK has started to decouple its economic growth with emissions. And this is quite an interesting one where we've seen an increase in in our GDP, but not at the expense of increasing emissions. So we've started to see that convergence between emissions and our GDP, and we need to see that continue. So the growth is not dependent on emissions continuing. And there are some excellent policy frameworks that we have to thank. Next, please. Both in terms of the planning framework and obviously for Wales specific, the global goals that we have. This has got fantastic resonance internationally, and in UK Parliament, Lord Bird is trying to do something very similar by having a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for UK at a UK level. And these are sort of the frameworks within which we must operate. If we really want to build those better places that the Minister was talking about in her Building Better Places report, these are the framework that we must work within and make sure that all of our goals and targets come within these policy frameworks. Next, please. One thing I did want to just share is that there is often a concern that if we start to make policies tighter, more stringent, and regulations more stringent, we will see a decline in, for example, house building. And there's some work that my organization did about a year ago where we looked at the impact of different policies on home building, because there is a concern that the tighter the regulations, the more expensive it'll be to build homes, and so house builders may not be building so many. If you look at when, for example, in Scotland or France, when they started to have some of those more stringent heat demands. So the orange bar for France in 2012 shows the heat demand was limited to 50 kilowatt hours. And you won't see a decline in the number of homes being built. Similarly, the green chart for Austria, where the energy efficiency plan was introduced in 2012. Again, no decline in home building as a result. So it's not that if we start to have tighter home building standards, we're going to see a decline, because we do need those homes built, and government has set itself a target of building 1 million homes in the next 5 years. And I don't think we should be concerned about tightening up our future home standards as a result, because we shouldn't see a decline in home building. And there is, there's more hope emerging, because just the impact of COVID in the way that we're now treating our communities and the way we're treating our spaces and the way we commute, the way we're using transport. What does that mean, especially for Wales, which is more reliant than any other nations in UK on car use? What does that need to look like for us? It's fantastic to see the sort of work that Cardiff Council is starting to do by trying to have more bike-friendly cities, and the work that they've been doing on Wellfield Road and the centre of Cardiff by opening the city centre up to walking and cycling and things. These are tests that we need to start to look at. That's the last slide now. And there's some fantastic opportunities coming through. You may have come across the Donut City plan in Amsterdam, where they're looking at applying Kate Raworth's donut economics, where it's about how can we live within our environmental limits, within which the economic limits are going to be recognized, so you have better social communities being developed. The whole 15-city movement that Paris has picked up on. Cardiff, like I was mentioning, about how we want to make it more pedestrian friendly, cycling friendly. And I love the RTPI Cymru Plan the World We Need. And I think now is a perfect time for us to be able to do so, because I think there's a fantastic coming together of policies, the need and people's understanding of what needs to change. And I think businesses are right behind all of this. So hopefully we can work together in all of this. I think, as the saying goes, we talk about plan for the worst, hope for the best. But hopefully we can do plan for hope as we emerge from this and look to build back better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita and Rick. Right, I haven't seen any questions on the live chat, unless I'm missing it, Adam. Yeah, no questions. Well, I might need to use chair's prerogative then, if that's the case, just to start off. how important is behaviour change, would you say, to getting to where we need to be, as well as the physical infrastructure?
Is that to any of us?
Yes, I think so, to be fair to both of you. I mean, I guess, I mean, you're both having more of the engineering background. I guess there's a tendency to think about solutions, and I just wanted to open it up for that view. And this is a bit of a cue into the talk tomorrow from Lorraine Whitmarsh, who will be very much talking about this.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important part of it. So one answer I would give is that from the chart I showed showing the development of different transitions, if you compare the kind of technical transitions where you've got a new power generation technology coming in against the social transitions where you have, for example, people stopping smoking, not using asbestos, phasing out CFCs and ozone depleting materials, those have actually generally happened quite a lot faster once you reach the kind of tipping point where people start to realise that it's an issue. There's policies that start to come into that, and then eventually you typically get regulation that follows up on that. So I think given the timescales that we're looking at, we absolutely need to be looking at exploiting both of those kind of changes in the short term. But I guess there is still a link, because the changes that you can make as an individual or in the way that we use our built environment, for example, are somewhat constrained by the technical, what is actually out there and built.
Yes, I would very much agree with that, because I think you need a good mix of policy, some incentives for people to do so, as well as, the carrot and stick mix, and then behavior change, because we've seen that with plastic bags, we've seen that with, just the movement with how people, have seen what came out of the Edinburgh programs, what it means to just pay 10p, and then the reduction that we've seen of like 70-80% in use of plastic bags, because most of us were hoarding it in our garages anyway and just decided to open it up and take them to the shops. So I think behavioral change is critical, but it needs to be alongside good policy incentives, because like with the insulation, when the policy was there and we were moving toward things like carbon code for sustainable homes, we saw a massive peak in insulation measures taking place. But as soon as that went away, the incentives went. And even though people recognize that these are good things to do, until it's followed by the consistent measures of how easily available it is, the policy is there to back you up, and there is enough information available for people to understand what works best for them. Behavioral change, I think, will be critical, but it does need to be supported by these things.
Okay, thank you. Ben has just said that I'm not sure we're talking over each other unless our things are interfering in any way. The other question I had, given I suppose that we're predominantly planners, would be just how important is place to getting everyone to buy in, I suppose, to the carbon narrative. And I think that's probably initially to Rita, bearing in mind, is there anything we can do at Wales level that's different to anywhere else? But even Rick, from your point of view, in terms of, do once people associate the narrative with like a low carbon town or low carbon city, is there any evidence that people then grasp and do things in a different way?
I think place is critical, and I think we've seen that more in the last 6 months. Just that sense of community, the importance of having things near you, the importance of the foundational economy, the access to support, goods, services. I think, this whole movement towards the 15 city where you can have your commute, your school, your GP surgeries, or food, all of those things nearby. I think place making and having good places, I think, is going to be critical, because at the end of the day, when something like this happens, you are, and we're starting to see more of that, because now you're seeing, city level lockdowns where you're now going to be restricted, and we're seeing that in Rhondda and Taff and Caerphilly, for example. Those people need to make sure that the places they're in is sufficient, keeps them, sufficiently resourced in terms of what their need is. And I think that's going to be critical. We keep talking about, how globally we've all become closer. Yes, things like technology has made us closer, but we're still relying on things like food and our basic needs that we need to have access to continually, that we've become so reliant on that we've almost taken them for advantage. And you take something like this to then suddenly put the spotlight on things and go, well, hang on a minute, we're not getting those things that we were so used to. So I think placemaking just needs to be seen with that sort of a spotlight of when things go wrong. Is our place, keeping us occupied and keeping us safe and healthy, and are the things as available as they could be? And again, for us, our homes, we're spending much more time in our homes. Are they healthy? Is there good thermal comfort? Is there access to everything you need? Just adaptability as well, because one of the things we're starting to look at is not just, do we have the thermal comfort, but how can we make it more adaptable, so you're not having to find a little corner in your home to do working from home because now you have no choice, but try and make your walls much more flexible so you can start to adapt. So as we start to build new homes, can they turn into mini offices? Can they be used to have your family in one place as well as your home and working areas? So I think those things have suddenly been brought up more in the air because those things are critical and we recognize them now.
Rick, did you have anything to?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think looking at the transportation of things, I mean, if the extreme case, if you look at international imports of food, for example, then I think there's quite strong links between the kind of food security debates and the climate change problems, because if we're having to restrain our use of those kind of transports to bring things in, then we've got to look differently at where our food and other things come from, which points you towards a much more local kind of place. And our example was it's particularly the long distance international flying and shipping that's very difficult to electrify, but the same applies for any kind of moving things around. If you can make things more local without causing other problems in doing so, then that makes everything easier. You need less energy to do that. I think there's, do you want me to answer this? Or there's also a question about cement. So the question was, sorry, I don't know if everyone can see them, that I talked quite a lot about cement production and that the mineral industry is actually taking significant steps to deliver net negative emissions by 2050 within the UK concrete and cement sector. So absolutely, I mean, I don't want to try and talk down what anyone is doing. We need to be doing all of these things, and if we can achieve that, then that's great. We're simply trying to say that this is a big challenge, and we shouldn't be not doing things because we think we might be able to come up with new ways of doing things. I think, well, if you have another take on it, then that would be interesting to hear. That it seems like a lot of those plans are quite reliant on various forms of carbon capture and storage, which is quite a big development that will need to be put in place to make that happen. So anything that we can do to not need to produce that cement and deal with that will help. And maybe by focusing on taking the what we've committed to, which is zero emissions literally, at the moment that means that cement will be illegal because we can't produce it without emissions. Obviously that could change, but maybe that points towards different ways of thinking about things that might actually lead us towards different solutions. So if thinking about the fact that we won't have cement points us towards new ways of building things or using spaces more flexibly, as you were saying, then that's really valuable to point us in that direction.
Thank you. Yes, having cycled past Roos Quarry and the huge Aberthaw cement plant the other day, it is definitely still there and still emitting, despite the ultimately probably the closure of the power station. Do we have any other questions? Adam, I can't see any, at least in terms of the Q&A chat. I'm struggling to read all the questions to get the full.
I can't see anything.
Okay. No, that's no worry. We've only got a couple of minutes to go. So I'm happy to draw the session to an end, unless just a final call for questions. Otherwise, it remains for me to thank Rick and Rita for really interesting presentations. Yeah, I could ask questions all day, but that's not my role here. Thank you, and what a great start. And so I said, just to those, the rest of you who are on the call, this is a week of talks laid on by RTPI Wales. Hopefully you'll join many of the other ones. They're generally mid-morning, mid-afternoon throughout the rest of the week. We have this sort of thematic program around climate action and the role of the planning system. And hopefully this just nicely sets up the ones for tomorrow. One in the morning, which is to do with behaviour change, and one in the afternoon, specifically around the energy system. So, otherwise, I kind of want to say, a round of thanks for our speakers, but I don't know how you can do that in terms of this technology. But otherwise, yes, a personal thank you from me.
Thank you.
And